Well, thank you very much, Mrs. Chairperson, for giving me the floor on this issue, which was already mentioned this morning. It's a difficult issue because it's, in a sense, an invisible issue compared to the warming, where we have numbers to put. In the Paris Agreement, less than a year ago, the COP21 included an Article 12, which reads, "All parties shall cooperate in taking measures as appropriate to enhance climate change education." What does that mean? The reasons for this article are clear to me. Schools are on the front line to communicate the challenges of the next decades to the incoming generation and to the civil society. Children under 15 represent today a quarter of the world population. Never before the world had so many children. And most of these young peoples, the ones living in middle or low income countries, will be the ones to suffer if adaptation and mitigation of the climate change are not sufficient. But they are also the ones who are and will be in a position to act, as the Laudato Si says, this youth has a new ecological sensitivity and a generous spirit. I will quote several parts of the encyclical. What could be then a climate change education and its goals? There exists today a very solid scientific consensus, the word is in Laudato Si again, on climate, on which the industrial, economical, political changes are based. But bending the curve, the expression from V. Ramanathan, in order to limit to 2 degrees is a difficult goal to reach. Emotions and generosity will not suffice to create the appropriate and long-term behavioral changes in the civil societies worldwide. From now on, these societies must understand the scientific message, and understand is more than believing, which is not a matter of opinion. And those societies are used to discuss opinions in the newspaper, on the television, and not scientific facts. They have to realize it has universal value, to trust it, to reason about the consequences on lifestyles, and to accept to act rationally. Education is the way to communicate to children and youngsters, to the adults who will be the parents of the next generation, and to their parents of today, the ability to understand with critical thinking, beyond emotion and beyond generosity, and the will to act. The recent UNESCO report, Education for People and Planet, where there is a splendid foreword by my neighbor, Jeff Sachs, Creating Sustainable Futures for All, outlines in some details, very precious, how this education challenge, as Pope Francis calls it, can be addressed in school, and what are its expected benefits. And one could list a number of those benefits on climate change awareness, a well-designed curricula, etc. In the past, education, which is by itself a slow process, always adapted to the relatively slow changes from one generation to the next, whether these changes were physical or social, like the Industrial Revolution and a number of others, or the demography. But within the next 15 to 25 years, global warming will be 1.5 and 2 degrees C or more, unfortunately, within 20 or 30 years. Nothing as fast was experienced by humans in the last million years. And the generation who is now in schools will barely be adult when experiencing the temperature rise and its consequences on weather, water, agriculture, housing, transport, etc. So my conclusion is that in parallel with industry or transports or land use, with similar urgency, educational systems must invent and implement changes, and they must do this at a pace which they never experienced in their history. They don't know how to do that. In 1880 in France, at the time Louis Pasteur made his great discoveries, life expectancy at birth was 40 years. In 1950, before the generalization of antibiotics, it reached 60 years, a 50% gain in half a century. Most people agree that this gain was due not mainly to the use of drugs, but to education of mothers and progress of hygiene based on Pasteur's scientific work. And in France, hygiene was explained, taught, and practiced in all schools when primary education became compulsory, 1881. For climate change education, this lesson should not be forgotten. Education can deeply and durably change behaviors, and that's what we need. So, giving a renewed science education where the youth discovers happily the depth of the best results of research, the Laudato Si again, is not sufficient. The Pope writes, integral ecology requires an opening to categories which transcend the language of mathematics or biology. End of quote. So understanding climate change and beginning to understand at school and coping with it requires to deal also with social systems interacting with complex natural ones. And here the word complex comes. Schools use to reduce in teaching various subjects things to simplicity because that makes it easier to understand by the pupils. But here we have a inevitably complex message and scientific message to communicate. Hence, the first step, already not so easy, of this opening to categories, is to introduce a new interdisciplinarity in curricula without losing the rigor of science subjects. Interdisciplinarity should not be only a conversation about things. A second step to properly deal with the education challenge is more difficult to implement in the schools. It should aim at conveying to the youth in an argumented way a critical eye on the human roots of the ecological crisis, leading the students to love technology, to practice it, but sometimes to question it, since techniques separated from ethics shall barely be capable to self-limit its own power, says the Pope. And in terms of ecological imprint, the cost of high human development with today's accepted index is extremely heavy. It's figure 1 of this UNESCO report, of which I recommend the reading. So, those are two important steps for education. But climate education requires a third step, the empowerment of children who have to become agents of change now and in the future. The traditional school mostly aims at the top-down transmission of knowledge. Also, of course, recent evolutions stress the importance of skills in parallel with knowledge and emphasize an inquiry pedagogy with a more horizontal relation from teacher to student. This empowerment can begin in active and inclusive schools where local solutions are explored, invented, argumented, implemented, and analyzed by the students, teachers, parents, and the community, completely different from the vertical top-to-down transmission, without undermining, of course, the essential role of the teacher. Potential topics for this are numerous: agricultural changes, improve water and air quality, understanding extreme events, all being as an act of love expressing our dignity, quote again. And ultimately, and maybe this is the fourth step, to implement global solutions, the youth has to develop empathy for other people, to consider all humans as brothers and sisters, embarked in the same global fate beyond nations, religions, and culture. This may seem naive, but, and I quote again, there is no systems which completely cancel the opening to good, to truth and beauty, neither the ability to react, which God keeps encouraging in the depths of human hearts. So we can be positive on the youth capability to achieve this. So I summarize: to build a critical mind and a hopeful heart. Indeed, school for all, but no longer school as usual. A school with more interdisciplinarity, more science, a more critical eye on technology and growth, an empowerment of children, a trust in the human heart, the hope for the future, and the power of spiritual values. Well, these goals may seem a total utopia, knowing the state of education in schools in so many countries worldwide. I could have a long list of the problem. 1 billion children today, and I remember you, it's a quarter of the world population, children. 1 billion children today do not have a proper education. Over 250 million have just no schooling. At the current pace of evolution, 30% of children in the poor countries will not have primary education in 2030. Half of the 60 million refugees today are youngsters, a large fraction of them without schooling in camps. In the last years, the spending for education has decreased in more than half the rich OECD countries, as did decrease the international aid for education towards the developing world, which had significantly increased in the first year 2000. Certainly, implementing climate education in this extremely uneven, unequal context will not be easy. Nevertheless, avenues are opening to do it, both locally and globally. We have Article 12 of the Paris Agreement, which is signed now by the countries, so it has to be implemented. We have the UN Sustainable Goals, especially number 4 on education. We have this UNESCO report, and last but not least, we have the Encyclical Letter. They all go in the same direction, and the letter has a full chapter on education, chapter 6. So I will give a few more concrete examples of possible lines of action. First question, how best can one help educational systems, educators and teachers? In the last 2 decades, we have witnessed how effective for deep changes in basic science education has been the involvement worldwide of the scientific community. And this is because very high figures, Nobel Prizes like Georges Charpak, Mario Molina, Leo Lederman, leaders of National Academy of Science, Bruce Alberts, Vice Minister in China, Wei Yu, all have pushed and used their influence to make science education change, especially in developed as well as in developing countries. Now, since 1988, thousands of scientists worldwide are gathered in the IPCC for climate and in UNEP for biodiversity. Their reports are based on the depth of the best results of research and are decisive for global awareness and political choices. These scientists all over the world represent a formidable potential to implement climate education. I could witness in the last decade the importance of the leaders, scientific leaders I just mentioned, when in a country they started a move. It has really changed things. So the suggestion is that the pool of scientists which are around climate research could contribute very much to that. In Germany, next month, an international meeting of scientists will discuss how to integrate climate change at all levels of education. But let's be more concrete. One could propose that in the future, each report of the IPCC be accompanied by the production of a multilingual resources for helping teachers, adapting the message to them of primary, secondary, and university levels. This is suggested by actually the co-president of the IPCC, Valérie Masson-Delmotte. Could this be funded and organized at a global scale? Could this be implemented then in Catholic schools and others? Supported by UNESCO, science academies, and indeed IPCC, even if it's done outside the IPCC, because it's not in their term, such an action would have a formidable impact. It's just an example. Today, out of 78 national curricula analyzed by UNESCO, only half of them mention ecology. This must change. A second idea, creating a global networks of schools. Children have to speak to each other the world over. A year ago, a workshop at this academy, Children and Sustainable Development, addressed the question. And over 20 grassroots organizations were present, and there are much more than that existing, and they were ready to form a global network to accompany teachers before listening to the conclusions by Cardinal Turkson. Since 2003, the Academies of Science, joining in the Inter-Academy Partnership, have an active science education program which is supported by many of its members. Yesterday in Paris, in front of the President of the Republic, we celebrated the 350 years of our Academy of Science. Education that was in front of 60 presidents or representatives of science academies in the world. Education was outlined again and again and again. In Germany and Africa, the Siemens Stiftung, with experimenter in France, the Fondation La Main à la Pâte, explore how to accompany teachers in science and development issues. Next November, during the COP22, the Academy Hassan II, the Science Academy of Morocco, has accepted my proposal to organize a workshop, one-day workshop on education and climate change. And a few days after, UNFCCC has, among many other side events, there is one side event on education, key driver to scale up climate action. And of course, I hope to report what we have done here in these two meetings. Now, how to establish children empowerment, which was mentioned this morning by Father, I don't remember. That is your name, but okay. As a possibility with millions of children and organizations. This has to be organized. There is an excellent paper in this conference last year, workshop here by Joachim von Braun, who leads the Development Institute in Bonn in Germany, about children agency. And he develops very strong and clear arguments to establish and plan this in schools and communities. He cites eco schools in India, Peru, Bangladesh, Ghana. But again, it has to go beyond goodwill, generosity, emotion. It has to become technical. Changes in education are slow, and I come to my conclusion. They are slow because of the magnitude of their scale and the mediocre resources in many countries devoted to the continued professional development of teachers, and often the poor salary of these teachers. Yet, there is no time to waste to implement Article 12 and climate change education. Catholic education has a considerable potential to do so and to show examples. I wish that the present meeting relayed that the COP22 will contribute to launch an ample movement in this direction to achieve the ecological conversion, that's the word of the encyclic, and the pursuit of integral ecology and spiritual ecology education advocated by Laudato Si. Thank you.